Imagine a crowded supermarket on a Saturday evening in November 1985. Babies in carts, fluorescent lights, a man in a denim jacket reaching for a loaf of bread. Ordinary noise, ordinary errands. Then a small car pulls into the lot. 3 figures get out, masked. Some have face paint. One walks toward a car where a child sits waiting for his family. He raises a shotgun and fires at the child. Then more shots. Panic, screams, people running, falling, getting up, falling again. By the time the gunfire stops, 8 people are dead. A 9-year-old boy is among them. This is Aalst. This is November 9, 1985. And to this day, no one has been convicted. I'm Clara de Wilde. Welcome back to Still Unanswered. Today, we spend an hour and, a long stretch with one of Belgium's leading scholars of political violence, Dr. Laurent Verbeek from KU Leuven, to go through the Brabant Killers case, what happened, how the investigation failed, and why this wound has never closed. Laurent, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Clara. It's difficult to talk about this without feeling the weight of the victims. I'm honored to be here and to try to explain what the records tell us and what they do not.
Right. I want to start where listeners feel it first, with the scale. Laurent, just to ground us, the accepted toll is around 28 people killed and dozens wounded. Does that capture the human scale correctly?
Yes. The commonly cited numbers are 28 dead and roughly 40 to 50 wounded, depending on how you count psychological trauma and minor injuries. But numbers alone flatten it. These were families, shopkeepers, children, and the randomness of the violence is what still haunts people.
Laurent, I'll be careful to separate confirmed facts from speculation throughout. Laurent, give us the short primer. Who were the Brabant Killers in the way the courts and investigators describe them?
Investigators and the press constructed, understandably, because eyewitnesses remembered certain archetypes, a core trio. The giant, a very tall, imposing figure. The killer, the executioner who walked calmly through parking lots and aisles and shot people at close range. And the old man, a middle-aged driver and logistical operator. Beyond the trio, authorities estimated at least 4 to 10 people were involved in logistics, vehicle thefts, and support. But, and this is important, those 3 nicknames are practical shorthand for witness testimony, not indictments.
So much of the reporting focuses on those figures. But when you look at the crimes, and we'll go into the timeline, 2 things are striking: the extraordinary, often gratuitous violence, and the relatively tiny sums stolen. Why is that important?
Because it forces a basic question. If the motive was robbery and profit, the level of violence is irrational. Total take, by most estimates, was only the equivalent of 150,000 to 200,000 euros. For dozens of murders, repeated massacres, children shot in parking lots, that amount is nowhere near proportional. That mismatch, money versus brutality, is one of the clearest reasons investigators and scholars ask whether money was the primary motive at all. It pushes you to consider other explanations.
We'll come back to those explanations. But first, let's walk through the case's arc. You describe the late 1970s into early 1980s Belgium as a fraught moment. Unemployment, extremist groups, a police force under strain. Paint that picture for listeners.
Belgium then was not unique in Europe, but it had its own pressures. Economic stagnation, social anxiety, and the political extremes on both the left and right were active. Importantly, public trust in institutions, particularly the gendarmerie, was already fragile. There were real scandals: corruption, poor coordination across language and administrative lines, and documented infiltration of far-right sympathizers into certain security milieus. That context makes violent acts, unexplained disappearances, and alleged cover-ups especially combustible, because the public was primed to distrust official explanations.
Okay, let's go back to 1981, the Etterbeek barracks burglary. Describe it, and why investigators later thought it was probably the beginning of this train of events.
On December 31, 1981, the Gendarmerie barracks in Etterbeek was burgled. Automatic weapons, ammunition, and a vehicle were stolen. Some of those weapons later surfaced in contexts linked to the Brabant crimes, and certain individuals connected with extreme networks were later implicated in other violent acts and arms trafficking. Whether the Etterbeek theft directly supplied the Brabant Killers is hard to prove, but that theft provides a plausible origin for how military-grade weapons could enter a criminal circuit without clear paper trails.
Then, 1982 starts the first wave.
Yes, 1982 is when attacks appear that match the modus operandi: violent, often pointless shootings accompanying robberies, cross-border activity into northern France, and the theft of vehicles used later as getaway cars. There were attacks on gun shops, on small stores, but nothing yet like the 1985 supermarket massacres. Still, the pattern of taking cars, the mix of crude and professional tactics, and the cruelty began to form.
Let's pause on Maubeuge. That was in France, right? They shot at police there.
Correct. August 14, 1982, a grocery store in Maubeuge, across the border, was robbed, and police who arrived were fired upon and seriously wounded. This showed two things. The perpetrators felt emboldened to engage law enforcement with heavy firepower, and they were willing to operate beyond Belgium, complicating jurisdiction and cooperation between police forces.
And then, Anderlecht, December 1, 1982, the jewelry shop, plus the family slaughter in the parking lot. Many listeners will find that attack particularly chilling.
It was chilling and pivotal. A jewelry store is robbed, then the gang encounters a family in the parking lot and murders 3 members. Then comes back into the shop to shoot a boy at point-blank range. They leave with minimal goods, a few €1,000 worth of jewelry. And what stands out is the purposelessness. It's not just brutality, it's gratuitous, almost performative violence. Many investigators later pointed to Anderlecht as the moment the gang's pattern shifted from opportunistic robberies to something more terroristic.
That word, terroristic, brings us to 1985 and the supermarket massacres. September 27, 1985, seems like a turning point with defies attacks. Walk our listeners through that month, and then Aalst in November.
September 27, 1985, saw multiple attacks on Delhaize supermarkets, Overijse, Braine-l'Alleud, and they were notable for starting in parking lots, where attackers shot customers and families before entering the store. By October and November, this pattern escalated. Aalst, on November 9, is the culminating atrocity. It was a busy Saturday evening. The attackers fired indiscriminately at people in the lot and inside the store, killing 8 and wounding many more. The public reaction was shock, one might expect, but it hardened into a deep, simmering rage because the killings felt utterly senseless. And then, after Aalst, the attacks stop. abruptly?
Abruptly. That's a question I want to return to. Why stop? But first, the tools they used. Shotguns, submachine guns, silencers even. You and others have noted some weapons and ammunition were oddly similar to those used by elite police units. Tell listeners about that.
The weapons list that emerged from ballistic evidence and witness reports is striking. 12-gauge pump-action shotguns, often described in the press as Winchesters or SPAS-12s, an Ingram Mac-10 45, an H&K MP5 SD5 silenced variant, and various handguns. Add to that the use of a rare type of 12-gauge buckshot whose manufacture and distribution was uncommon, and which, in Belgium, had been used by the Gendarmerie's Groupe Diane. The combination of specialized ammunition and the use of an MP5 SD5, typically a military or special forces piece, raised questions that the perpetrators had training, access to military supply chains, or both.
So the weapons and tactics seemed at times amateurish and at times professional. Is that right?
Exactly. The gang made basic tactical mistakes at times. No gloves, exposure of faces, leaving potential traces. But at other moments, they showed precise planning, stealing and repurposing cars, knowledge of back roads, and a calmness under fire indicative of training. That contradiction fuels many of the competing theories about who was behind it.
Let's talk about the investigation itself. It becomes almost as controversial as the crimes. Start with the Borins case, one of the early missteps that undermined public trust.
By 1983, police had zeroed in on a group from the Borinage region. They had a supposed forensic link, a weapon, witness testimony, and what was described in court as guilty knowledge. This culminated in the detention of several men. But the alleged confession and ballistic links were problematic. The Andalus attack happens while some of these men are in custody, meaning timing doesn't fit. Then it emerges a German ballistic report undermined the forensic linkage, and that report was withheld by the prosecutor. The charges were dropped. The men alleged coercion and abuses during prolonged interrogations. For the public, this looked like incompetence at best, deliberate framing at worst.
And this is where the narrative that the investigators were corrupt or inept begins to take hold, with missing reports, suppressed evidence, files lost. The canal discovery in 1986 complicates all that further. Walk us to Ronquières.
In 1986, divers in the Brussels-Charleroi Canal near Ronquières recovered a cache, firearms, bulletproof vests, items linked to the Brabant attacks. Authorities initially said the area had been searched before, in 1985, which raised immediate questions. If the canal had been searched, how were these items not found until 1986? Some experts who later examined the recovered items thought they had not been underwater for a full year, which suggested the possibility the items had been planted after the initial search. In 2019, several retired detectives involved in the Ronquières search were questioned on suspicion of manipulating evidence. The suspects deny wrongdoing, but the episode irreparably damaged confidence in the integrity of the investigation.
Listeners, that idea of evidence perhaps being planted, I know you feel how corrosive that is. Laurent, on the ground, what possibilities does that open, and what must we be careful not to claim?
We must be rigorous. The possible explanations include a genuinely botched first search, items deposited later by unknown parties, or deliberate staging by people trying to mislead investigators. Each carries different implications. If evidence was staged, then we face the prospect of individuals within the police or with access to investigatory resources consciously distorting the trail. It's a serious allegation and must be treated as such. But we also must avoid leaping from suspicion to assertion without proof. The fact remains: procedural failures, missing files, and contradictory statements did occur, and they limit our ability to draw firm conclusions.
Okay, we need to talk about theories now. I want to run through the main ones: ordinary criminals, far-right strategy of tension, rogue gendarmes/ex-security, and the deathbed confession leads. Let's take them one by one. Start with the ordinary criminal gang theory.
The simplest explanation is often the most plausible: a criminal gang whose violence escalated. There are elements that fit: weapons thefts, petty robberies in early phases, people with underworld activity in the periphery. Some attacks were prosaic and made poor tactical choices, consistent with amateurs' learning. Psychologically, some violent criminals escalate out of sadism or to impress peers. The problem: the use of specialized ammunition, silenced submachine guns, and the ability to evade capture over years make this hard to accept as the whole story. Also, the minimal financial gains for enormous human cost are a poor fit if pure profit motive dominated.
Next, the far-right strategy of tension theory. You and I both know this carries heavy implications. Explain it carefully.
The strategy of tension hypothesis posits that elements of the far right, or rogue segments of stay-behind networks, such as those associated with Operation Gladio in other countries, committed or tolerated violence to create fear, destabilize democratic institutions, and push politics to the right. In Belgium, certain far-right groups like Westland New Post and individuals with paramilitary training have been discussed. Some of the weapons and ammunition links and the gratuitous cruelty are used as supporting evidence. But one must emphasize caution. Belgium's parliamentary inquiry into Gladio did not find proof that the stay-behind network carried out terrorism here. There is circumstantial evidence and plausible connections, ex-gendarmes with ties to far-right networks, but no definitive smoking gun linking a political strategy to the Brabant Acts.
Short, plausible, but unproven. Then the third dominant line: rogue security personnel and ex-gendarmes.
This one is perhaps the most concrete, but also fraught. We have individuals like Madani Bohush and Robert Beyer, ex-gendarmes, implicated in arms thefts, trafficking, and violent crimes. The Etterbeek theft offers an origin story for police weapons entering the criminal sphere. Observers note police-style tactics, the type of ammunition, and the MP5SD, all of which make it plausible that current or former security people were involved. On the flip side, after decades of investigations, arrests, and trials in other cases, no court has definitively linked these figures to the Brabant massacres. The prosecution needs incontrovertible evidence, and in many cases, that evidence is missing, contaminated, or never collected.
And then there are the deathbed confessions and late leads. There was one that made headlines in the 2010s when a man allegedly confessed to being the giant on his deathbed. Walk us through what actually happened there and why it didn't lead to closure.
A man, once a gendarme, told his brother on his deathbed that he had been involved, allegedly, the giant. Years later, the brother went to police. That prompted renewed press interest, re-examination of witness photos, and some eyewitness identifications that suggested resemblance. But forensic corroboration, DNA, ballistic ties, unambiguous material evidence did not materialize at the level necessary for prosecution. In the Belgian system, you need a legally admissible proof standard to indict and convict. Alone, a deathbed claim and matching witness recollection after decades are insufficient. Memory degrades, photographs can be misleading, and without physical evidence, the courts cannot proceed. In the Belgian system, you need a legally admissible proof standard to indict and convict. Alone, a deathbed claim and matching witness recollection after decades are insufficient. Memory degrades, photographs can be misleading, and without physical evidence, the courts cannot proceed.
I want to ask a blunt question here, Laurent. People often say, why didn't the state want to solve this? How much of that is justified anger, and how much is conspiracy fever?
Clara, the anger is wholly justified. Families and survivors suffered unimaginable loss, and the investigation displayed errors, cover-ups, and suspicious behavior that rightly provoked outrage. That said, conspiracy narratives sometimes leap beyond evidence. There were genuine institutional failures, fragmentary police structures, suppressed reports, and possibly deliberate tampering. But proving an orchestrated, state-level plot requires a burden of evidence that we do not have. So, valid anger at incompetence and possible corruption, cautious skepticism about sweeping claims that require more proof.
We need to cover recent developments. From 2018, a federal team revisited the case. Thousands of tips, DNA, exhumations. Then, June 28, 2024, the prosecutors said the active investigation was closed. What happened in that period?
The federal prosecutor's office assembled a small, dedicated team facing a mountain of material, a 2-million-page file. They re-interviewed about 1,800 tips and witnesses, analyzed roughly 600 DNA profiles and 2,700 fingerprints, and exhumed around 40 bodies to obtain DNA for comparison. These are extensive forensic and investigative acts you would expect in a modern cold case review. Despite these efforts, no match produced the conclusive legal threshold for prosecution. In June 2024, authorities declared that all realistic investigative avenues had been exhausted. Legally, they closed active work, but the case can be reopened if new evidence emerges. The emotional impact, however, was devastating for survivors.
David van de Steen, a survivor who lost his parents and sister in Aalst, called the decision a crushing blow and labeled the system incompetent and corrupt. He speaks for many. Laurent, what does this closure mean for the families and for public memory?
It means frustration and a renewed sense of being dismissed. For families, every procedural review that fails to produce justice feels like the state denying their dignity and pain. Public memory evolves. The case becomes less an active investigation and more a symbol of institutional failure and of unresolved terror. That symbolic weight can fuel deep social distrust. The justice system may have exhausted practical leads, but closure in civic and emotional terms has not been achieved.
Listeners, I want to take a moment to stress that although prosecutors closed the active probe in mid-2024, the law was changed recently. Parliament removed the statute of limitations for certain murders, influenced by this case. So it is legally possible to prosecute if credible new evidence appears.
Yes, Belgian lawmakers had extended limitations, and in 2024 they removed them for certain grave crimes, a direct consequence of long unsolved cases such as Brabant and Dutroux. That step preserves the possibility of accountability even decades later.
Let's return to some unresolved technical puzzles that keep people up at night. First, The canal evidence and its condition. If items were indeed not underwater since '85, as some experts suggested, what are the realistic scenarios?
3 realistic scenarios exist. 1. The initial 1985 search was cursory, and items were missed and only placed deeper later by natural movement, less likely given the condition reports. 2. Third parties, perhaps unrelated criminals, dumped items later. Perhaps weapons were being moved through different hands. 3. Deliberate planting by someone with access to both the items and the canal after the initial search. The third scenario is the most troubling because it suggests local manipulation of the investigative record. But again, proving intent and chain of custody decades later is very hard.
Wow.
Unbelievable, yes.
Another technical issue, a rare type of buckshot and the use of an MP5 SD5. These are not typical gangster gear. What does that suggest about supply chains and connections?
It suggests access. The MP5 SD5, a suppressed variant, was not commonly available on the civilian market. The rare buckshot links to military and elite policing stock. Possible explanations include theft from police stores after the Etterbeek burglary, procurement through illegal arms brokers, or, which is more incendiary, direct access through people with a security background. This is one reason ex-gendarmes and rogue security personnel appear so frequently in the investigative margins.
We need to address some painful ethical questions. If ex-security personnel were involved, did colleagues protect them, or did institutional culture simply make errors more likely? Where do we land on that spectrum?
Hard to land definitively. There is evidence of negligent or even protective behavior in some episodes, missing files, withheld reports, superficial searches. Whether this reflects a protective conspiracy among colleagues, fear of reprisals, incompetence, or cover-ups to shield reputations is unclear. Institutional culture in that era was hierarchical and opaque, which can shelter wrongdoing either intentionally or through inaction. From a historian's perspective, motive matters. Protecting a colleague differs from protecting a network. Both are corrosive, but legally and morally distinct. And we must remember, institutional reforms were later enacted. The gendarmerie was abolished and integrated into a new police structure, precisely because such dysfunction had become unacceptable.
Let's spend time on victims' voices. David Van de Steen is one. Tell listeners briefly what his trajectory shows about the human legacy of these crimes.
David's story is searing. A 9-year-old who witnesses the murder of close family, wounded himself, grows up with trauma, becomes a public voice demanding truth and accountability. His public statements exemplify the psychological and civic aftermath. Lifelong scars, difficulties trusting the state, and an insistence that collective memory not let the case dissolve into rumor. Survivors like David ensure the crimes remain part of Belgium's moral accounting.
There are so many other survivors and families. They report PTSD, fear of supermarkets, lost livelihoods, small details that add up to generational harm.
Yes, and that generational harm is one reason why, even now, amateur sleuths, books, podcasts, and documentaries continue to sift evidence. People need narratives to process trauma. The danger is when narratives become conspiracies detached from verifiable facts. We need to balance empathy for victims with epistemic rigor.
Laurent, listeners will want to know, Given what you know about Belgian policing, political networks, and the case's files, is there any single theory you find most convincing?
If pressed, I lean toward a mixed model. Criminals who had some professional training and ties to people with security backgrounds, a hybrid between organized criminality and rogue security elements. The evidence tends to fit a group that included people with tactical expertise, access to military-grade arms, and criminal intent, rather than a pure political terror cell or purely amateur gang. But, and this is crucial, lean toward is not the same as prove. We still lack the smoking gun chain of custody, admissible DNA linking individuals to scenes, or fully reliable witness testimony that a court would accept.
So, the truth may be messy and mixed.
Exactly. Human affairs rarely fit into clean categories. Multiple motives, multiple actors, overlapping networks. That is often how the worst crimes are organized.
Let's imagine for a moment you're advising a team reopening the case with unlimited resources. Where would you spend the effort? What would you try differently?
First, archive management. Ensure a complete, digital, cross-indexed catalog so nothing can be misplaced. Second, high-priority forensic reanalysis where admissible. Re-examine preserved biological material using modern genomic techniques, and carefully map DNA to family trees when necessary and ethical. Third, transparent international cooperation for any weapons tracing. Fourth, witness re-interviews with trauma-informed methods. Decades later, memory is malleable, but there are still kernels of corroboration left. Finally, examine the institutional archives for internal memos and procurement records. Sometimes the paper trail of supplies or transfers reveals more than witness testimony.
That sounds expensive and painstaking, but maybe necessary. Now, a question listeners ask: do you think we will ever have definitive closure?
I don't want to be dour, but historically, cases like this can be solved by a single overlooked scrap connecting to a living network. A dispossessed wallet, a preserved hair with viable DNA, a whistleblower who can corroborate a deathbed claim. The removal of the statute of limitations keeps the legal door open. So, possibility exists, but probability is low. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It only means it's contingent on new evidence.
2 short interruptions here. First, wow. Second, unbelievable. Sorry, that's my audience reacting to the difficulty. Laurent, before we go to the final section, legacy and lessons, are there any myths about the case you want to debunk for our listeners?
2 immediate myths. 1. That Gladio was proven to have directly ordered the Brabant murders. That's not supported by parliamentary findings. 2. That everything investigators did was deliberate sabotage. While there were suppressed reports and errors, many investigators acted in good faith under difficult conditions and with limited forensic tools at the time. Holding people accountable for errors is one thing. Assuming a monolithic conspiracy without proof is another.
That's an important distinction. Okay, last major section, legacy. What did the Brabant Killers do to Belgium as a polity and a culture?
They left a series of scars. Politically, they fed distrust in the gendarmerie and catalyzed police reform. Legally, the case influenced changes to limitation laws. Culturally, it placed a long shadow over supermarket trips, family routines, and national confidence. And morally, it forced citizens to reckon with the possibility that their protectors might be compromised. Those are heavy legacies.
For listeners who grew up after the 80s, you might think the case is an old news item, but for Belgians, it remains visceral. I want to close by asking you, as a historian and someone who has read the files, what keeps you awake about Brabant?
Two things. First, the ghosts of the victims and survivors who deserve better than unresolved suspicion. Second, the institutional fragility, how easily a flawed investigation can become its own scandal and then erode public trust. I worry that unless societies build robust, transparent mechanisms for investigating mass crimes, these patterns will repeat.
Listeners, we promised to end on the still unanswered questions, the questions that make this case impossible to forget. I'll read them, and then Laurent will add a closing thought. 1. Who exactly were the three men we called the giant, the killer, and the old man? 2. Why so little money for so much blood? 3. Why the lull in 1984 and the terrifying return in 1985? 4. Why did the attacks stop after Aalst? 5. How much did authorities know and when did they know it? 6. What do we do with deathbed confessions decades later? And 7. What does it mean for a society when its worst crimes remain unsolved?
My closing thought is simple and somber. Unresolved crime corrodes more than bones. It corrodes trust. But justice isn't only a verdict, it's a process of truth, acknowledgement, and reparation. Even if we never get a courtroom conviction, preserving the record, listening to survivors, and insisting on transparent procedures are forms of justice too. We owe that to the victims.
Thank you, Laurent. For listeners, we'll include a detailed timeline and source links in the episode notes. If you have memories, family stories, or material relevant to Brabant, there are official channels to contact investigators, and please consider the ethical and legal weight of sharing information publicly. This story is heavy. It lingers. It asks us to hold grief and skepticism at the same time. This story is heavy. It lingers. It asks us to hold grief and skepticism at the same time.
Clara, one short addendum. For anyone inspired to research, approach archives with patience and humility. These files are messy, and the people involved were human, both the perpetrators and the investigators. Nuance matters.
Absolutely. Before we sign off, one final moment of silence for the victims. Thank you for listening. I'm Clara de Wilde. Dr. Laurent Verbeek, thank you again.
Thank you, Clara. Take care.
If this episode moved you, please consider supporting our Survivors Fund or subscribing. Until next time, we keep asking the questions others have left behind.